We're very proud to have Phil Rubinstein here, who's going to speak to us about American history and how that relates to the tradition, the Republican humanist tradition in the United States, which gives us the basis for the principles upon which we can get out of this current existential crisis and build up a whole new vista of possibilities for humanity.
Now, there were people who were here yesterday, and I think what we're going to try to do also is have time for questions and answers, and we have people from the Danish organization and so forth, and my wife from some organization. She's all over the place. But anyway, she'll represent China today, or Taiwan or something. Anyway, I sort of want to do two things quickly, and maybe some of it we can, hopefully will come up in the questions and answers. And I think we have time, we'll talk for a while, we'll have a lunch break. But I also want to update, and that's a good starting point, what Tom went through yesterday in terms of even some of the developments, at least in the discussions, over the last 24 hours or 48 hours since, 24 hours since Tom spoke. One of the things that occurred at a meeting and a discussion yesterday, and actually you'll see part of it in the EIR that just came out a couple of days ago, is that besides the Glass-Steagall, the drive for Glass-Steagall, which we'll use that to discuss actually some of the point that Michelle made, American history, and what it really is, as compared to what most people think it is. And I think this is interesting for a discussion in Europe, because I think many Europeans, given the propaganda of the last century or half a century in Europe and the United States, don't really have a complete sense of the American system, American history, as compared to what most of the United States has become itself today. And what really the LaRouche movement is trying to not simply reconstruct, but you could say construct anew with elements of further development that are appropriate to what we've had that LaRouche has discovered in many respects and added to. But we are also at an extraordinary crisis in human history. And I think I will say something that may get me in trouble. I think it's important to bring this up in Denmark. Denmark, from my simple observations, and they're pretty limited, I admit, is a funny place because of two reasons. One is it's, relatively speaking, in better shape than most countries. I can't think of too many countries in the world that are better off. Just for example, it has one of the lowest debt-to-income ratios in the advanced sector. For example, the United States, even the debt to federal revenue, I'm not talking about the gross domestic product, but the debt to federal revenue is 560%. In other words, we have a debt that's about $16 trillion, a public debt. The revenues for the last year was about $3.5 trillion or $3 trillion. So it's 5 times the amount. Most of the European countries are 200%, 300%, 150%. Denmark is 82%. Okay? The employment level and so forth. Now, however, it's also a country of 5.5 million people. It's a relatively small country. So, despite, I'll make jokes about my wife, and it's a good thing. As one person once said, actually when Lainey and I got married, I'll tell you a story, also an insight into Denmark. We had in the party, or whatever you want to call it, two flags, an American flag and a Danish flag. Now this was in the United States. And the Danish flag was a little bit bigger than the American flag. And first of all, you're not supposed to do that, you know. But anyway, we had a very wonderful fellow at the time, an elderly gentleman named Yulin Jack, who had been the borough president of Manhattan. He was a significant figure in the development of black political significance in the United States, and he was associated with LaRouche and so forth. And he was at the wedding, and when he noticed that the Danish flag was bigger than the American flag, he said, "It's a good thing it's a small country, or we'd all be in trouble." So, but you do get this phenomena of, well, you know, how do you become a world historic figure? How do you make an impact in Denmark? And I think the main point to recognize is that human beings are a manifestation of their mental capabilities. And in that sense, I can't map out a plan, but in that sense, the size of the country is not as important as what it produces for humanity as a whole to be able to improve its relationship. And you have, of course, interesting examples. Ola Romer, the first person to measure the finite speed of light. Ørsted, who arguably was one of the most significant figures in the development of electricity, electromagnetism, our knowledge of the kinds of things that have really transformed the world. And that's a good example of what I was talking about yesterday. That despite the problems that we've had as human beings, you can say most of the time we've not been operating in the best way. But even those few periods of progress have dominated, in many ways, the overall development of the human species if we pick it up again in a new period of crisis. So this period of the end of the 18th and early 19th century, when you had people like Ben Franklin, Ørsted, Gauss, Humboldt, and so on and so forth, and perhaps some controversial contributions by the British. This was a period of enormous change. A great deal of what we experience today depended upon that change. When we talk about electronic communication, you had the telegraph was introduced in the early 19th century. All of a sudden, the cables were laid across the Atlantic by the middle of the century, and you could communicate instantly. It's relatively speaking. You know, it's funny to think back. It's almost impossible to think back, and this still existed through the 19th century, where to communicate with a relative who was maybe a few hundred miles away took you 2 weeks. To communicate across the Atlantic Ocean generally took maybe months. Yeah, interesting, just to give you an idea of how strained things were. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1st of 1863, they have a holiday in Texas which is called Juneteenth. And because they didn't find out in Texas, of course it was in the middle of the Civil War, they didn't find out in Texas about the Emancipation Proclamation until June of 1865. So it took about almost 2 years for them to get the exact document and so on and so forth. You know, communication wasn't, you have to laugh at the situation now, you know. People want an answer, they get the computer, they hit the Google search, and they've got 1 million things to choose from. It's a different order. That doesn't mean that it's intelligent in that form. But things have changed, and you could go on and on. Obviously, you know, I travel in the United States many times from the New York area to Los Angeles. It's a long trip. It's 5.5 hours on the plane. Of course, in the 19th century, this was something that took you weeks to get across country. Even when the train was finally brought in, it took about a week to go from east to west or west to east. So, and the potentials that we have, on the other hand, are enormous. If you look at where we could be as compared to where we are today, in terms of scientific knowledge, in terms of capabilities, it's really astonishing how little we have done in the last 50 years. And that's really what's at the root of the crisis. It's not a monetary crisis. In the sense, it's not simply a financial crisis, though the financial system is pretty well dead, completely dead on an international scale. But it's also a crisis of physical economic development. Take the example of China. China is a very interesting case. It's a country that is relatively stable, that has a significant growth rate over what has now been almost a generation. They've had almost a generation averaging 8%, 9% growth rates. So this is now one of the biggest economies in the world, but it's an enormously impoverished country. It's a 1.4 billion. You have to realize that despite all the talk about the development of China, there's about 900 million people who live in villages, who are essentially living on $1 or $2 a day equivalent, or a few kroner. At 900 million, you have to realize the number of people who are peasants in China is twice the population of Europe. You need these comparisons to get the order of magnitude in your mind. It's enormous. Even though they have 400 or 500 million people who have been improved in their living standards. But they're facing a crisis because they've been dependent upon export markets and cheap labor. So what happens when their labor is no longer cheap enough, or the population won't tolerate it anymore, and the markets are collapsing? The United States income, for example, the average income in the United States has dropped 5% in real terms since 2010, since the recovery. Officially, the recovery by the official Bureau of Economic Statistics the recovery began in 2010. We've been growing 1 or 2% since then. Yet the average wage in real terms has dropped 5%. Consumption is down. And so on. You get a very strange view of the world. And I think the one point I was making about Denmark is things are a little bit better here. But some of it's illusion. When we were in Germany, we had a discussion, and I raised the fact that there's tremendous inflation in the economy for people. That we're actually verging. We first of all have relatively high rates of inflation, and we're verging on a hyperinflationary takeoff. And one of the younger people, who was a little bit on the academic side, said, well, there's no inflation. The official government statistics say that it's only 1.5% or something like that. And I said, well, that's not really the case. If you look at the actual things that are essential for people to live, food, energy, etc., healthcare, education, these are all going up 15, 20, 30, 40. For example, potatoes in Germany are up 44%. Butter is up 30%. Now, so this young fellow said, yeah, but they test 250,000 items to come up with their inflation figure. I said, that may be. I don't know all the 250,000 things that they're checking. But I assure you the way they're balancing these figures is insane. For example, in the United States, which I do know, they have the Consumer Price Index, which is a couple of percent. However, there's two things that they don't count that are taken out of the market basket. One is food, and the other is energy. Now why? Because they're too volatile. They go up and down too much, so they throw the statistics off. And of course the general actual trend in food in the United States is way up. Even though food is expensive here and cheaper in the United States, from the standpoint of the way people live in the United States, food prices are going way up. And Americans spend an enormous amount of money on travel. There's no public transportation for the most part. And healthcare. Healthcare is hugely expensive in the United States, just to take those examples. Education is immensely expensive. I don't know what it's like, but for example, the average student who comes out of a simple four-year school, not a doctor, not some specialty, is $50,000 to $100,000 in debt. So when you're 22 years old, you have $50,000 to $100,000. And roughly speaking, just take a rough figure of $250,000 krona. And I don't think that's the case in Europe overall. Education is much different. So people spend enormous amounts of money on these kinds of things. Also, old age security, which is extremely tenuous in the United States. Look at the case of Detroit. What people may not realize, which is a little twist in this that makes it even worse. Not only are they taking, because Detroit's been put through a bankruptcy, or being put through a bankruptcy. Now, I'll come back, because I think I'll try to make it a little more sensuous to people, what this means to Americans and to the world. This is a city, well anyway, the public workers, firemen, policemen, civil servants, are going to lose their pensions, or 90% of their pensions. In the bankruptcy proceeding, what is being discussed, and the big story in the United States and in Europe, is that the big problem is the cost of pensions, health care, and of course these are great ironies after the $1 trillion bank bailouts, okay, which is still underway. But the big problem is the pensions. So not only are they going to get 90% of their pensions cut, but in the United States, many of these public employees do not get Social Security. This is a part of the arrangements they made in their contracts to get a better pension. They gave up the idea of Social Security. So they didn't pay into the Social Security fund. Which means that not only don't they have a pension now, they don't have anything. Even somebody like myself, who had relatively low income most of his life, now that I'm of age, I get Social Security. These public workers will not get Social Security.
Who asked them not to get that, or to? Who asked them not to?
I think they made a certain arrangement when they were told they were going to get these pensions if they didn't, otherwise the employees have to put into Social Security. So there may be something with the public employees, but I think there was actually an arrangement to increase the pension, but now they're finding out the pension doesn't exist.
Wasn't that also a special thing for the United States law?
Mm-hmm. The Michigan state law also said that the pensions were sacred, they couldn't be touched. They were actually written into the Michigan Constitution. However, this is now being overridden. So you can see the law gets twisted in many ways. So this is the kind of reality. And you have to understand, you have to look at what is Detroit. I don't know how much of this comes across. Probably the one thing I can think of that's, that I've seen that comes close to it is North Rhine-Westphalia, the industrial core of Germany. Because Detroit was the center of American industry. Absolutely. If you could imagine for a second the United States, you have the Great Lakes in northern New York, along the Canadian border. You have Lake Huron, Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, Lake Michigan, Lake Superior. Okay? And these lakes formed a kind of inland ocean. And once you built the Erie Canal in the early 19th century, you literally had a connection from New York City, up the Hudson River, across the Erie Canal, into the Great Lakes, and the Great Lakes took them into the Midwest of the United States, ultimately the rail system, the farmland, and in the northern Great Lakes they had something called the Mesabi iron ore range. So this was a huge deposit of iron ore in the northern part of Michigan and so on. This became then the industrial center of the United States. It also included immigration from Northern Europe, from Germany and other places like that, which built up an industrial core. So if you look at this area along the bottom of Lake Erie into the state of Ohio, Pennsylvania, over into Michigan, across to Illinois and Lake Michigan, and so forth, you had glass, rubber, steel, automobile manufacturing, tractor manufacturing, machine tool centers that were enormous. This was the heart of the machine tool sector in the United States. This is the sector that builds machinery. This is the core of any modern industrial society. The machines that build machines. And these are always the most skilled workers. Now, and I mean this was, I can give you the examples, I was in Buffalo, New York, where at one point in around 1960, there were 250,000 industrial metal workers, not assembly line necessarily. Industrial, they formed metal. They were machine tool, what we call tool and die. But these were the guys who made the machines that formed the automobiles, that formed the engines, aircraft, and so on and so forth. By the time I left Buffalo, there was nothing left. They had a steel plant of 25,000 shut down. Automobile plants shut down. Now Detroit was the center, the heart of American industry. Not just cars. In fact, now that the cars have been built elsewhere, the real lesson of Detroit was what happened in World War II. This was called the arsenal of democracy. This is really the U.S., in a certain sense, entered the war before Pearl Harbor, because there was the Lend-Lease to the British and the Soviets. And we began to produce at an incredible rate airplanes, boats, tanks, alongside of still manufacturing agricultural products and so on and so forth. Now this city, also a large number of people from the South, particularly African Americans, immigrated to Detroit to get better jobs, to get skilled jobs, almost like an immigration pattern. Come to the North, get a better job, your children get an education. Like an immigrant, you become better off. Now there were many conflicting elements in this, but that is part of what happened. So this was true of this whole area. Cincinnati, actually famous for having a lot of German and Northern European immigrants, was one of the leading machine tool centers in the United States until very recently, when it began to shut down. Now, to give you a sense of this, Detroit had almost 2 million people in 1950, 1960. It was the 4th largest city in the United States. It had one plant that it had was called River Rouge, which was a mile long along the Detroit River. And it was an integrated plant of steel, glass, rubber, automobile production, the whole thing in one plant. This was what was turned into producing the armaments for World War II. And there's the famous story where I forget the exact numbers, but at one point Roosevelt asked for, I don't know, it was 5,000 airplanes, and people thought he was insane, that this couldn't be done, there was no way to gear it up. And by the end of the year we had produced 50,000 planes, alongside of a whole bunch of other stuff. So what happened? This city is now, it was once 1.8 million people, the 4th largest city in the United States. It's now 680,000 people. And it's about the 30th largest city in the United States. A lot of the labor in the United States has moved to the South and the Southwest. It's cheap labor. It's non-union. It's barely above minimum wage. They broke the back of the auto workers. Lynn had intervened in 2005, 2006 with an Economic Recovery Act to rebuild not the auto industry, but to take the core skills and the machine tool capability and revive that in terms of building magnetic levitated trains, water control systems, NWAPA, and so on and so forth. But this was rejected. They made a rotten deal under political pressure and under financial pressure. So this is an example. You know, I was personally born in a city less well known on the east coast of the United States, Baltimore, Maryland. And this was also, during World War II, became an immense industrial center with hundreds of thousands of skilled workers. Many of them were brought in because of the Baltimore port. It was about 1 million people when I was born. Today it's about 600,000 people. A good part of the city is considered a death zone. In fact, in other words, it's drug infested, heroin addicts, AIDS, etc. This was the neighborhood I was born in. It's a bunch of houses that I took Laney past at one time. That are boarded up, rats, and so on and so forth. This is the reality of the situation. And there is no recovery in the United States. The thing that people have to realize, and the international financial system, is when you talk about trillions and trillions of dollars in derivatives that are supposedly owed, that somehow have to be transacted, and the entire global economy produces, even in dollar equivalents, which are probably exaggerated, maybe $70 trillion. You're talking about ratios of debt that have no connection to the physical economy, that are 10, 20, and I would say, to really understand it, virtually infinite. Because in a speculative economy, every bit of this debt has to be reinvested to let the money grow in value, to pay off the previous debt and realize some further income from it. So where does the income come from in this massive expansion of money value? It comes from looting the real physical economy. Ultimately, the lives of the population. This can happen more rapidly or more slowly. But this is really the nature of a concentration camp. The first concentration camps were slave labor camps. And you simply worked people to death. Maybe you lasted a year on average. It was only later, in 42 and 43, that the Nazis implemented, quote, the final solution, unquote, which was a part of their own ideological insanity of, quote, wiping out the inferior species. They believed in the inferiority before, but the inferiority was used to simply promote slave labor. There may have been wild anti-Semitism, but they were using it for slave labor, which tells you something about the nature of the system. So you can have fascism today that might take other forms of destroying, you know, I'm not sure it's better if we destroy populations indiscriminately. So what if we're not racists and we're not anti-Semites, but we just kill a lot of people and we do it equally? We're equal opportunity killers. That, you know, that makes us not Nazis. You see, people get this is one of the great dangers of this whole idea that there's only one Holocaust. It can only be the Jews because of what happened in World War II. Now, the problem isn't that there wasn't a Holocaust. There was a Holocaust. 6 million Jews were killed, maybe a total of 20 million people under Nazi auspices, or at least in that range, if you include trade unionists, communists, Slavs, etc., etc. But there was the Nazis had a particular fixation because of the background of its leadership on wiping out the Jewish population. And in some places, they nearly succeeded. In Poland, for example, as people know, 3.5 million Jews, I don't know, less than 10% survived. If my father came from a village in Poland, nobody's there. So that's true, but that doesn't mean that what's happening in the Congo or what's going to happen to other populations is not a Holocaust. And that's the reality is we face a fascist policy in the transatlantic. And there's nothing else you can call it. This is the European Union. It's a perfect example. This is a supranational system, a supranational currency. It's run by, effectively, bureaucrats. It's not run by elected officials. There's no national sovereignty. Denmark, again, is somewhat different because Denmark refused to join the euro. So it has a slight degree of independence. But of course, given the dependence of Denmark on the transatlantic system, you can't delude yourself into thinking you're going to survive. There comes a point when you have to realize there is no place to hide. There is no nice, safe place that somehow is going to remain untouched by what we see go. Take the example, a good example of this is, and I'm not trying to paint simply a bad picture, because my point today is that we're also at a point of victory, which I think is also something that is a little different to be considered in Europe. Because we had World War I, which was an insane war that just butchered people. And really no one today argues that anybody was right in World War I. World War I was a British imperial operation from the word go. And some of this I might reference. I don't want to go too far afield. But the British were determined to stop the growth of the American system after the Civil War. And Edward VII committed himself to organizing a series of conflicting alliances which would lead to war. And ultimately that's what happened. And in one sense, the famous book, The Guns of August, is true. Nobody wanted the war, but somehow it came. As Lincoln said about the Civil War. Nobody really wanted World War I, but things got set into motion. Now the author of the book only hints at one thing, which is that the British Empire wanted the war. They did not want a coalesced alliance of developing nations on the European continent. They didn't want an alliance between the Germans and the Russians. They didn't want a French-German alliance, which was easier to break up. And the way World War I ended guaranteed World War II. Germany was, suppressed. It went through horrifying economic crises, the kind of things that scare people. You have to realize the point about hyperinflation is that it has a particularly devastating effect on the population. Because the insecurity is almost instantaneous. It's one thing in a deflation. You have a certain amount of money, your wages are going down, but prices are going down. So you somehow think, I can make it. In an inflation, your income disappears in 24 hours or less. So what happened in Germany is people would literally go to work on Monday and then get a loan against their paycheck on Friday. And they would take even only a partial amount. Because they would go and spend it right away. Because if they waited until tomorrow, it might be worth nothing. You have to think of the insecurity at that point. People don't know if they're going to make it through the next day. And this is, the entire system is oriented to this. Totally pump the money into the system, and keep it going so that it never becomes a hyperinflation. You can't control that. At some point, the hyperinflation dominates the entire system. And we're seeing that eat away at the entire transatlantic system. To give you an idea of some of what this means. Because look, the existing powers, at least some of them, know that the system is dead. They really don't have the illusion of saving the system. Their illusion is saving their power. They're going to keep control of people's lives and control the financial system. And if this means large-scale death, then it means large-scale death. So you see the situation in the impoverished areas, or what could happen to China or India in the case of an overall collapse. But the fact is they mean the same thing for Europe and for the United States. For example, the Bank for International Settlements and J.P. Morgan recently put out a study. And what did they say the problem is in the transatlantic and in particular Europe? They said the problem in Europe is we have these anti-fascist constitutions that came up after World War II in Italy, in Greece, in Spain. And these anti-fascist constitutions have protection of the population, of the labor force, and that has to be removed so we can lower the health care, lower the pension funds, lower the education, lower the living standard. This is not something I'm not interpreting. This is what they say. They use that phrase. J.P. Morgan Chase has a study that says effectively the same thing. Now you have to, and what does this now depend on in Europe? To a certain degree what it depends on is pessimism. Cultural pessimism. Because what happened? After World War I, you had cultural pessimism. You had an insane cultural breakdown, the rise of existentialism, the rise of positivism. If you actually look at this, it's one big picture. The attack on science, the attack on people like Einstein and Planck and others, even less central. The whole security state imposed in the United States. After World War II, the Cold War was intentional. The idea was to break any real sense of optimism. What happened in Europe in the 20s and 30s? You had complete social breakdown, economic breakdown, and the truth is Europe, almost as a whole, in one way or another, either became fascist or accommodated to fascism. You had fascism in Italy. You had fascism under Franco in Spain. You had the alliance of some of the Romanian, etc., with the fascists, with Germany. You had in France, essentially 80% of France capitulated, was effectively fascist. And this was an acceptance of a world outlook that said there is no way to solve this, there is no way nations can live together, and so on. This was picked up after World War II with the idea that the problem in World War II was the nation state. The problem was Prussian paternalism. This wasn't the problem. The problem was an insane fascist imperial rule, slavery, which is the empire's outlook, the British outlook completely. You know, the first concentration camps were in South Africa. The British ran the first thing called concentration camps, when the Boers were put into concentration camps. At the end of the 19th century, this was somewhat the model. This is the real history. You know, there are other side roads. You know, I won't be able. Slavery in the United States was a British-controlled operation from the beginning, from the initiation of actual slavery under the African company that was sitting on the board of the Anglo-African company was John Locke. Well, he was one of the first people. He endorsed slavery. These are stories about the British that are little told.
So wasn't the Belgian king running a virtual
concentration camp in the 19th century? Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, a small, I don't know how interesting this fact is, but Graham Lowry in his Century of War writes about the First World War, where he basically says that a few days before the war broke out, the British National Bank were bankrupt.
That could, I don't know that history so well, but that could be. Look, the British have been bankrupt for a long time. The fact of the matter is that a great deal of their view of the world, particularly since around the World War I situation, was to capture the United States. One way to look at their approach was they tried to defeat us in the Revolutionary War. They failed. Now, there's more to it because the real key to the United States is only partly the Revolutionary War. What happened after the war was that the British tried to manipulate relations amongst the colonies, amongst the states, so that they would each have independent control of their commerce, no central government, and free trade. And this is really how they began to separate out the South. It even began that early. Now, Hamilton, Franklin, and Washington were the core of the people who brought together the American Constitution, which is not 1783, but 1789. The Articles of Confederation, which were the interim document, failed, and the country was about to fail. Hamilton, in particular, saved the United States, and that's what's relevant to today. We formed a union, a nation, not a collaboration of independent small colonies. And the British tried to defeat us militarily in 1812. They failed. They then tried to subvert the country in the Civil War, which really began with Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, and the rise of the expansion of slavery, which really only began in about 1810, 1820. You have the cotton trade, the cotton gin, but the basic point was they turned the Southern economy into a one-crop economy, where all the manufacturing was done in Great Britain or other such places. And the whole of the South became a one-crop slave economy. When people like Lincoln knew, and John Quincy Adams, that the country could not survive that way, which is what ultimately led to the Civil War. But the British were defeated in the Civil War. They failed to break the United States up. And from that point on, the British took a different path, which was subvert the United States, including the assassination of presidents. It may not be, maybe it is clear or not. Think of the United States. Lincoln was assassinated, Garfield was assassinated, McKinley was assassinated, Kennedy was assassinated. 4 of our presidents were assassinated. There was an assassination attempt against Roosevelt, against Reagan, against Ford. I mean, this you add it up, and it's an enormous percentage of the American presidents who were under that kind of threat.
Plus, it was like in very crucial times
of
history.
Absolutely. So, so the British, this is what happened to the continent of Europe. One of the critical moments was, of course, the U.S. coming into World War I on the British side. But that was partly because of the presidency we had. Woodrow Wilson was a Confederate. He wrote a defense of slavery when he was a professor at Princeton, or a defense of the Confederacy. Okay, they brought the Ku Klux Klan back, and so on and so forth. Now, what we face today is a similar effort that has been going on since really the assassination of Kennedy and in 1971. So we're talking about 40 to 50 years. Because what have we been dominated by? Monetarism. What happened in 1971 was the end of the Bretton Woods system, and they took the currencies off of fixed exchange rates, which set off an accelerating wave of speculative monetary control of the financial system. That's all you needed to do. One of the cores of Roosevelt's approach, and I think the main thing I'll emphasize is the intention that Roosevelt had to understand what went on in the United States. But the Bretton Woods under Roosevelt was a fixed exchange rate. Because under fixed exchange rates, you actually have a way of regulating speculation. And you don't need speculation. There's no need to worry about risk in the change in the financial relations. You dominate the finances by the physical economy and by relations amongst the nations themselves that are cooperative, developing relations, which is the only way to get to peace. And peace is a much bigger thing right now than it ever was. Not at all costs, but we have to find a way to answer the question that comes up. Well, how can you get these nations to work together? They fight all the time. Well, we have no other choice. And that's the way we're going to have to approach it. Now, what we face today, and what we're living in the United States in particular, but really on a global scale, is what's the dominant character of strategic relations today? Number one, the collapse of the transatlantic financial system. Number two, the post 9/11 security state. The post 9/11 war on terror. This is why you have people even debating this, Snowden, the NSA. What's the excuse for what Snowden revealed? We're living in the war on terror. What we're doing with this is we're saving you from terrorist destruction. You're not a terrorist. In fact, the way they look at it, the way they kind of handle it is, if you don't want your phone tapped, you must be a terrorist. Because if you're not a terrorist, why would you care?
If people actually say that in the street, I mean, yeah. I don't have anything to hide.
Yeah.
Why shouldn't they tap me? They can tap me all they want.
Right?
The problem is, you don't know what it means to have something to hide. No. They can redefine that.
Yeah. And the truth of the matter is, what we're going to be doing in the days ahead is coming back, and you'll see this in the EIR. But Lynn discussed this last night. We're going to expose the truth about 9/11. We've been telling it for a while. But now we're going to make it the central focus alongside of Glass-Steagall on the economic front to bringing down the present oligarchical control. Now, I'm not going to go through the details of 9/11 because even in the last EIR we have this. But the truth about 9/11, the thing to get at from, I think it's important for people here to remember or to find out, during the 1990s, in particular, Lynn was making the point that the explosion of this financialization of the world economy, which really began with the 1987 crash, and then you have Greenspan comes in, there's a wall of money, and then derivatives, which are almost nothing. In 1987, 1988, 1989, they begin to explode in 1992, 3, 4, and from there, that leads to the repeal of Glass-Steagall in 99, because the idea is we need every possibility we can possibly have. This is the only way to run our financial system. And then you have the pure financial economy for the last 15 or so years, 14 years, since the repeal of Glass-Steagall. But that was just the final step. Now, we knew, and Lynn knew, that this was headed to financial disaster, destruction, that it was an untenable system. Now, it's worth referring back to January 3rd of 2001. This was a little bit before Bush was inaugurated. And I'll tell you, there's a great deal to think about in terms of this Bush family, as bad as Gore was. Because, remember, that election was a very strange election. Unique, and one of the unique, only one or two cases like this in American history. Well, maybe two cases. There was the Tilden Hayes election of 1876, and this election, where I'll never forget. For those, I wish you were there. In November of 2000, we had a cadre school near Los Angeles. I always remember this. And it was the Sunday before the election. Tuesday was the election, Sunday was the cadre school. And Lynn, somebody asked Lynn about the election, and Lynn said, well, how do you know that we're even going to know on Tuesday who won this election? And everybody sat there and went, what? You know, we never heard of such a thing. Usually you find out, they run the computers and, you know, the polls are closed at 8 o'clock, and by 8:01 you know who the president is, because, you know, they have all the statistical projections and so on and so forth. So we said, people, you know, I said myself, I have no idea what he's talking about. You know, well, we're going to know maybe Wednesday morning, okay, if it's a close election. No, he said, how do you know that we're even going to know who won this election? Because Lynn had this is what Lynn means by an insight into the future. He knew something about the election, but he also knew what the strategic situation was. He may not have had a specific idea, maybe he did, but he knew that the strategic situation called for extraordinary steps. And so Bush was put in office. The Bush family was put back in office by the Supreme Court. They didn't win the election. And we had 8 years of George W. Bush. But what Lynn, and then now we've had 5 years of Obama. And Obama and Bush, there's very little to choose between them. Very little. Obama's policies, he goes through a certain amount of rigmarole. They're the same thing. War, austerity, cutbacks, and that's it. This is the Chicago School of Economics, or I would, on the Obama side, you know, it's really the Austrian School of Economics. No government, the survival of the fittest. Now, in January 3rd of 2001, Lynn did a webcast. And in that webcast, I think it was in the questions and answers, he said the likelihood is that this administration, that is the Bush-Cheney administration, would be an administrative administration. He even said Cheney would play a bigger role. He's a more experienced guy at this point. That they would manage and administer a security state, a police state of a certain kind. That's what their goal was. Because the financial situation, the economy was completely out of control fundamentally. Yeah, and then he compared it to the Reichstag-Brand. He said that you could have an incident like the Reichstag-Brand that would be used to bring this kind of apparatus into control. Now, 9 months later, we actually had certain ideas that something would happen in Washington, D.C. We put out a warning of a terror incident. It was focused really on a kind of a radical anarchist demonstration in Washington, D.C. for that very weekend, that very period. Now, of course, what happened? 9/11. Now, 9/11 was an inside operation. It was done by the Saudis, run by the British, and the Bush family, as it has always done, collaborated with these financial, and in particular, close to the Saudi ruling families. Bandar was a personal friend of the Bush family. And Bandar financed, at least known that Bandar financed 2 of the hijackers. Bandar is now the head of intelligence for the Saudi royal family. And they're part of the British apparatus. They have these things then break down to a kind of insanity that goes out of control. What are the Saudis backing? They're backing the most extreme Wahhabite elements in Chechnya, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, different operation in Egypt, and so on and so forth. But what are they unleashing? They're unleashing hell. They're unleashing a 1,000-year religious war with the splits between the Shiites and the Sunnis, Christians and Muslims. And of course, this is what was discussed by people like Samuel Huntington during the 1990s. We would move from a Cold War to a cultural war. And that's what's been unleashed. This is all public. You know, it's conspiracy, but it's partly conspiracy based on the idea that most people don't want to think about these things. So we can make it public. They just won't listen to it. They won't pay attention to it. And so you have literally and what did we have last year? 9/11 Benghazi. They celebrated 9/11. These are two of the worst incidents ever directed at the United States. Of course, the 9/11 killed almost 3,000 people. But this was not a bunch of lunatic, independent Al-Qaeda terrorists. 15 of the 19 were Saudis. And of course, one of the few flights that left the United States, and I'll leave also the rest of this video that we did, the few flights that left the United States was about 15 members of the Bandar family who took off on an airplane from Texas, from Dallas.
Wasn't it the Bin Laden family?
I mean the Bin Laden family, I'm sorry. The Bin Laden family, yeah. Okay? Now, we're faced with this again. Including the potential for terror incidents, but really what we have to do is, what are they really doing? They're using the 9/11 condition, the Patriot Act, the other forms of this, the NSA, the collaboration of the NSA with the British, with the Germans, and so on and so forth. They're using this to impose a fascist state, step by step by step, as the way of dealing with their financial collapse. You know, it used to be, I don't know how many people remember, but it used to be the idea that, maybe it was because of World War II, that depression and war went together. It wasn't some strange thing to say, well, you have a financial crisis and this might lead to fascism and war. People, this was the way you understood the ruling forces worked. Distraction to get what they want. To tie populations and politics down, to make people submit, to terrify people. Now, the other side of this that I want to get across is, oops, I have to do something real quick. Is that indeed we're very close to winning this. And I mean that in real terms, a victory. Bringing Wall Street down. Exposing London and the Wall Street connection. Replacing the economic system with an American system, but which is not simply an American system. You know, the American system has its roots in the European Renaissance of the 15th century, in Nicholas of Cusa, in particular, in the Concordantia Catholica, which is a description, even though it's based on the church, of a representative republic, because he wanted that transformation in the Catholic Church itself. And out of this came an idea of the nation state, which also referred back to Plato and the republic, which is explicitly referenced by the American founding fathers. But you have this also, to understand it, you have to see this is what ran the first colonists. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Winthrop family, the Mather family, what led to Franklin. They developed what Lynn refers to as the credit system. Paper money, the credit system. This was crushed by the British when William of Orange succeeded in conquering England. And this was the fusing of the Anglo-Dutch Empire. Most of the financial empire had really moved to Holland. And London was part of it. But then with the victory of William of Orange, they came back and crushed the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But there was a continuation of it. And remember, Winthrop, for example, was an associate of Leibniz. This was a philosophical, political combination. The Winthrop family was very closely tied in to the circles in Europe who had come out of the Renaissance, the people who were involved in the Treaty of Westphalia. And this is a good deal of what's covered in Graham's book, The Making of a... What's it called?
How the Nation Was Won.
How the Nation Was Won. Okay? So, so out of this came the American Revolution. Ben Franklin, who was a protege of the Mathers, and so on and so forth. This was and when we talk about a credit system, it really is something completely different. money is not that important. Money is merely a means of dealing with certain issues in the physical economy that allow you to orient toward the future development of the... Because in humanity, you always deal with the future as a necessity. Because you always know, at one level, what you're doing will not be adequate to the future. You have to use what you're doing now to create resources and conditions and knowledge that allow the human species to act into the future. It's the nature of the human being when he's thinking right. I mean, in one sense, you see it in the simplest form in parents and children. What do you think? It may be a more limited form, but the idea is, okay, you live under certain conditions, you raise your children, and you want them to be able to know and do more than you did, if you're a good parent. And you want them to choose that on their own. In the United States, this story is often seen in terms of immigrants. The immigrant family comes in, the first generation is pretty poor, they work hard at usually a fairly difficult job, but they create the conditions under which their children are better off. But they're also better people, at least in terms of knowledge. So this is how you always operate. You know that we have to bring other people to a certain living standard. We have to be able to use their minds to the benefit of humanity. So we create conditions under which we expand the potential creativity of the human species. And that's economics today. Always, okay, today is going to run out. We're going to need something else. We're going to need greater density of energy. We're going to need greater resources. We're going to need greater means to get those resources. We need more knowledge to do that. We need a culture that produces the knowledge. And so you issue credit for central projects. It's not everything. Front-end projects, great projects that aren't going to be handled privately. Private resources may be brought into it, but they're not going to, no private company is going to build Nawapa. They're not going to run the risk. They're not going to build maglev because they're not going to run the risk. They're not going to have a space program. This idea of a private space program is completely bunk. All they're doing is taking everything that the federal government subsidized for 50 years and using the knowledge to charge people exorbitant prices to take a 5-minute trip outside of the atmosphere. They're not going anywhere beyond that.
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
But why is it a risk? Because somehow you guarantee that it will be productive and it will be...
It's a risk in terms of money. They may or may not make money off of it. It might not be quick enough.
Yeah. Okay.
So they see it as a risk. Okay? So this is a monetarist way of thinking. The only way you're going to use money is you have a division of labor and you have different cycles of production. The classic case of it is agriculture, as Hamilton develops this. Agriculture needs to be given a certain credit for what they're going to produce. As they are able to produce it, they're able to supply an industrial workforce, a manufacturing workforce, which now produces things that can be used by agriculture. But the cycles of production are different. So you use money to sort of square the accounts so that they have the ability to consume and so on and so forth. But money is not the way you measure the economy. It has no intrinsic value, no value in itself. That's what Hamilton put together. And these are things that would have to be, what did Hamilton do? He created the National Bank. This was agreed to by George Washington. And they took the debt of the states, of the colonies, and they basically guaranteed it by the federal government. They essentially rolled it over. They got more people to what do they call it? Anyway, invest in it, subscribe to it. Okay? And based on that, the federal government issued credit for great projects, for things that later became the Erie Canal and so on and so forth, for agricultural production. And indeed, the American economy did developed for a short period of time. Then, of course, we had a lot of problems, and we had problems amongst the founding group, particularly Jefferson and so forth. But then again, under John Quincy Adams, you had the second national bank. It was already in place, but then it was upgraded. And we had the greatest explosion of infrastructure in American history, probably in terms of concentration. Canals, the beginning of the railroad system. All this really began under John Quincy Adams in the short period from 1825 to 1829. And then the bank was overthrown. And who was one of the great supporters of the National Bank from the time he was a 23-year-old state legislator? Not 20, he was a little bit older than 23. About a 25-year-old state legislator. Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's policy was internal improvements, the National Bank, and I forget the third thing. He once said, he said, my program is like an old lady's dance, short and sweet. The National Bank, internal improvements, and I forget. Okay? He was a great promoter of the National Bank. He fought Andrew Jackson. And we've documented some of this. And then, of course, he led the country out to succeed in the Civil War. But what did he do? That's a longer story. And again, I think there's things I would only say that are misunderstood in the United States and in Europe. Lincoln was opposed to slavery. There was never any question about it. There was never. He was a 19th century figure. He had some beliefs that we would consider needed more development. But he was fundamentally against slavery, and was had no prejudices, and was a great strategic thinker. He was motivated, or he was educated, largely by Shakespeare, by Robert Burns, by the King James Version of the Bible. He was a student of science, even though he had no formal education to speak of. I mean, literally none. Maybe a couple of grades, a couple of years. But he was tutored by John Quincy Adams, by other leadership, Henry Clay, and he became a figure that the British hated, as almost no other figure until Roosevelt, until Lynn. And in many ways, Lincoln was hated more than anyone. Because at the same time, what did he do? He reinitiated a credit policy. He took the control of the currency back to the federal government. Because what happened, it's a simple story. He wanted a national bank, but when the war started, the Union had nothing. So they needed to get money. They needed to build up the armaments. He went to Wall Street. They turned him down. Our great patriots in Wall Street wouldn't lend Lincoln the money to fight the war. So what did Lincoln do? Lincoln started the greenback policy, which was a federal credit policy. And they built the biggest industrial power then known to mankind. We built the railroad system during the Civil War, or at least we began it during the Civil War. We had the greatest growth in manufacturing, metalworking, so on and so forth. This led to the other developments in terms of machine power, turbines, electric lighting. By 20 years after the war, we were beginning to use electricity to light up the cities. There's a big story behind that, but it was an outcome really of Lincoln's policies. This was picked up around the world. The Russians under Vida, Mendeleev, Vernadsky picked up. Vernadsky's father was a follower of Henry Carey, explicitly, and the American system economics. So this was all the burgeoning policy of the late 19th century. This is what the British deployed against Germany under Bismarck in the latter phase. I was really surprised to find out, for example, when General Grant, the guy who was the head of the Union Army, and then the President of the United States, a little bit after Lincoln, after he was sort of out of office and retiring, he took a trip around the world. And it was an interesting trip, but he went to Germany. And one of the things I was really surprised to find out was Grant and the journalist who was with him, they viewed Bismarck as one of the great minds of Europe. And Grant had a series of meetings with Bismarck discussing strategic policy, economic policy, and so on. Much of this, as I say, is completely lost. Now, to get to the, so I don't go on forever here, to get to the, what we're facing right now, you know, what is Glass-Steagall? And I think this also goes to the whole question of 9/11. What happened? Roosevelt knew what was going on in the world when he entered the presidency. I won't go into the story of his polio, that's been told. And it certainly had an enormous effect on his outlook on the world. I don't think he had a bad outlook to begin with, but he had a limited outlook. And going through the crisis with the polio changed him as a person who really had a great compassion and empathy for, you could say, the downtrodden of the world. And he committed himself, but he also knew that he saw economic crisis as the governor of New York. He was the governor of New York from 1928 to 1932. So he was the governor of New York in the middle of the Depression, or the beginning of the Depression. And he implemented in the state of New York many of the policies that he later implemented as the president. Concretely, he implemented a program of Social Security, effectively. A retirement program from New York State workers. He implemented a certain kind of welfare program for orphans, single mothers, and so on and so forth. He also took over, he fought the electric utilities, who were basically charging enormous prices in downstate New York for hydroelectric power and so on and so forth up by the St. Lawrence Seaway. He fought the utility monopoly. He fought the monopolies. He did all this. He built agriculture. And he was a great lover of trees, by the way. Maybe, you know, he considered himself to be a tree farmer. He owned a plantation, a farm of a certain kind, and they mainly grew trees. So he considered himself something of an agricultural expert. But nonetheless, he did these kinds of programs, education programs, and so on and so forth. All of these became a model for what he did at the federal level. So this is he's not a practical politician who had, you know, sneaky ways of trying to get things through and manipulating people, which is the general picture that you get of Roosevelt or even of Lincoln. Well, he was he was sharp, he was human, he was pragmatic, he wheeled and dealed, and that's really, he sort of just muddled his way through somehow. Now, the reality is that Roosevelt was clear on what needed to be done, including, in some cases, the updated 20th century version of it. To give you one example of this, in his public papers, he, they published later, I think they published them some of them in 1938, but he wrote the introduction to the volume that covered 1932-33, which of course when he was elected and inaugurated. And in it, he says explicitly, this is not paraphrase, he says, what was the policy of the New Deal, which is what his policy was called. Our policy, called the New Deal, is based in the preamble to the Constitution of the United States. And he quotes the preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, to secure our liberty and our security for ourselves and our general welfare for ourselves and our posterity, form the United States. And the Constitution follows from that. And that was his, you could say it was his theme. The general welfare, liberty, and security. The preamble of the Constitution. It's interesting to look at, because Lincoln based himself on the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. He quoted it over and over and over again. And in a sense, we fulfilled or began to fulfill the Declaration. Under Roosevelt, the idea was a true fulfillment of the preamble of the Constitution. Now, it's also the case. What did Roosevelt do? As soon as he came in, he demanded a total review of the banking system. I won't go into the details. Many of the banks were already shut and so on and so forth. He said we need an audit of the banking system. We really had, you had the Emergency Banking Act of 1933, which included Glass-Steagall as part of it. But it also included Securities and Exchange Commission, the Commodities Trading Board. It included the Deposit Insurance and Glass-Steagall, which was based on the idea that the audit of these banks would lead to finding out which banks were unsalvageable, which banks needed a certain amount of time to work it out, and which banks were salvageable. And then separate these banks completely from the investment banks, from speculation. And he used the word speculation over and over and over again. That we have to get rid of the speculative financial manipulators. We have to throw them out of the, we have to throw them out of the temple. Okay, the money changers out of the temple. All right, so this was his commitment. And Glass-Steagall was part of an intention, so that you can't understand it as simply Glass-Steagall. Because as he was implementing Glass-Steagall, he was implementing the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the Homeowners Lending Corporation. What were they doing? They were issuing credit to industry, to infrastructure, to agriculture. And of course the numbers, you have to kind of bring them up to modern standards. The first allotments of credit were about $500 million, $800 million. Now that doesn't sound like much today. The entire budget of the federal government expenditures was about $6 billion. Today it's $3.5 trillion. So you have to multiply that 800 million figure hundreds of times. It's the equivalent of about $300 billion in credit. Okay, and that's in a relatively deflated economy. So he had a massive credit system to revive industry. And of course what he did was he put people back to work wherever he could. You know, sometimes they were simply ditch digging. But he said, get them to work for a little while. And we'll get the industry running, we'll get the economy running, and we'll get real jobs. So this became Social Security. Of course, he actually had a plan then for health care benefits. Now, what did he do? I mean, to understand Roosevelt and to understand the difference, Roosevelt also knew by the early phases that we were headed for war. And certainly, remember, Hitler came in about a month before Roosevelt. And Roosevelt was opposed to Hitler from the word one. From the very beginning. And increasingly, as he saw these things unfolding, he was aware of the fact that we were headed for war. And so, a lot of what happened during the Depression, and you have to recognize, despite people talking, because he had problems from Wall Street, he was unable politically to shut Wall Street down. He had problems from the Southern Democrats, and so on. And so he was fighting a political battle to get the nation ready. Now there were efforts to cut back the budget and so on, but what he did do was he rebuilt American farm, agriculture, and American industry, based completely during this period on a credit system centered in the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This went around the Federal Reserve, which was essentially controlled. And when the war began to come, more intensively, 36, 37, 38, and then Poland in 1939, the United States was prepared to become the arsenal of democracy despite massive opposition inside the United States. To give you an example, when Roosevelt finally called for the draft, that is to draft Americans into the Army, this was, I think, late 1940. Okay? We weren't in the war yet. But when he called for the draft passed by one vote. I don't know what would have happened if that vote went the other way. One vote. I think it was something like 215 to 214. In the
can't say that one man can't make a difference.
yeah, right. Okay. So the United States at that point became the arsenal of democracy. Now the thing to realize is that the British had supported Hitler. The reason Churchill was brought in was because Churchill was an empire man who didn't want to be a junior partner to Hitler. He didn't want to be second. He was worried that Hitler would sort of run the empire. And so he said no. So he was brought in at the point at which Hitler was out of control. Otherwise, the accommodation to Hitler was British policy. Secondly, in a longer story, you have to realize the British from the 1920s on, a faction of the British recognized that the England was not going to be a great world power. And they were already oriented to the Commonwealth. Because the Commonwealth really represents a great deal more of what the empire means. That's 30 or 40% of the world's population, resources, etc. By 1947, the Commonwealth was created after World War II. And you have to look at a little bit more. That at least gives you an insight into the way they were thinking. Churchill was kind of an old empire guy. And he wanted to maintain the British Empire at all costs. That's why Churchill was removed after the war, to bring forward this Commonwealth policy. Now Roosevelt, what did the British do? Churchill demanded aid. They ran to the United States. But I tell you, you have to really appreciate sort of two things. One, when Pearl Harbor happened, Churchill came to the United States with his entire staff, and he spent 34 days in the White House. Talk about an uninvited guest, you know. Because he was committed to making sure that the United States followed the British demands on sustaining the empire. There would be no decolonization, etc. There were huge battles, despite everything that's said since then, between Churchill and Roosevelt over India, over the empire. Roosevelt told him to his face, "We will not fight this war to reestablish colonialism, to reestablish the empire. That's not our purpose." Churchill, just kept coming back, making demands, and of course Churchill did not want the alliance with the Soviet Union. Churchill wanted the Germans and the Russians to fight it out. And that was his policy the whole time. Yeah, I can refer you, if you read Eisenhower's Crusade in Europe, he repeats in very calm, very mild ways over and over again. Every time they wanted to open up the Western Front to land in France, Churchill would say, "No, we're not ready." We fought many sidetracks. Northern Africa was unnecessary. Italy was unnecessary. Probably by the spring or summer of 1943, certainly by Eisenhower's estimate, we could have landed in France. But Churchill stopped the pincer movement from southern France through Marseille, even after the landing in D-Day. He delayed it by weeks. He then sent, under Montgomery, a whole section of the Allied forces into northern Holland, into a trap, into a complete failure called Operation Market Garden. They did not want to win the war. They wanted to delay the war, to destroy Russia. They wanted the Pacific War, as Laney went through, to last for years. Roosevelt said no. Now he had to accommodate at times because it was an extremely tense alliance. Think about Roosevelt trying to hold Stalin and Churchill together. That's the way to look at it. You had two expansionist outlooks. In a way, you had the British Empire, which is really more dangerous. And you had this Soviet Empire, which was in many ways much weaker. And Roosevelt knew that if either part of this alliance fell apart, the world could be lost. So this isn't compromise. This is a necessity to win the war and then go beyond that. By the end of the war, Churchill and Roosevelt were not on particularly good terms. One writer makes the point that at the beginning of the war, there was a very close alliance between the British and the Americans. By the end of the war, a large gap had come between them. A whole different idea of how to run the post-World War era Japan, and so on and so forth. Now, I think it's even useful to look at, relevant to now, and then I will end on this, relevant to now. First, to understand that all of this was by clear intent. That is, Roosevelt's idea was the implementation of the preamble of the Constitution for the United States, for the entire population, industrial development, the development of the future. I mean, you know, there's a funny story. Under the CCC program, which was how they put some of the youth through training and whatnot, they planted 3 billion trees. That's a lot of trees, okay? And not million, billion. Of course, they you do it with seeds, but this was quite. He actually did this in part to stop the erosion in the central part of the United States. They did things in limited ways, like we're talking about. They built tree kind of walls that changed some of the atmospheric flows and so on and so forth. But now, what was Roosevelt's outlook from the beginning of the war to the end of the war? And this is a good example of what Lynn means. This was an individual, as a statesman, who looked into the future. What do we do after World War II? We're going to have destroyed Europe, destruction in Asia. The United States came out clearly as the greatest industrial power in world history. We produce 50% of the manufactured goods in the world. Not in the United States, or in the North, or in the Atlantic, in the world. So this was an enormous strength. Now, Roosevelt did not know, of course, about the atomic bomb. But his view was, he knew what was being worked on. His view was the destruction of World War II alone was enough to tell you that we have to end general warfare. By the end of World War II, of course, you had people like MacArthur, Eisenhower, much of the U.S. military was opposed to dropping the bombs because they saw no need to do it, and they also were very concerned about the idea of unleashing this kind of weapon as part of general warfare, that this was an entire order of magnitude, or orders of magnitude, beyond the destruction anybody had seen before. Keep in mind, in World War II, upwards of 100 million people lost their lives. This was not a small thing. The Russians, for example, by various estimates alone, lost 20 to 27 million people in one country. The Germans lost 8 million people. I mean, this is a country out of 80 million. And these were mostly young men, even amongst the civilians. So Roosevelt saw that this kind of destruction is what came out of colonial empires and an effort to divide the world amongst empires, amongst imperial demands. His vision of the United Nations was a community of interest amongst nations. This is why you had the Atlantic Charter, the Four Freedoms, and it was Roosevelt's conception that these would be the relatively simple principles. People were free of want, were free of fear, were free to carry out their religious beliefs. This was not part of the state, and so on. Freedom of development. That this was going to be brought to, India would be independent. Of course, this was the leading case in many respects. Africa would be decolonized. Asia would be decolonized. And these would become nations, part of the United Nations, as a deliberative, or you could say an institution where sovereign nations could work out problems, could debate problems, could initiate internationally significant great projects, and so on. Basically, what he wanted to do after his fourth term was become the Secretary General of the United Nations. Of course, he died, and it's worth knowing, there's no doubt whatsoever that the British knew he was going to die. Frankly, a lot of people knew it. He was not a healthy person. He because of the paralysis, he suffered in particular, as almost all paraplegics do, from high blood pressure. Because the kidneys don't function because you're sitting all the time. You get fluid buildups and you get high blood pressure. Now he may have had other problems, but he had extraordinary high blood pressure, what they call hypertension. And he was a very sick man by 1944. And the British were privy to the knowledge of his own doctors on this. So what was the policy of waiting and waiting? The policy was to wait until Roosevelt died. And that's why they fought to get Truman in the 1944 election. And so if you look back at what Roosevelt did in the Depression, which was an example, the Depression itself was less than we're being hit with. We're talking about a global cataclysm. But indeed, Roosevelt represents a clear example of how this battle is fought with the proper intentions and with the proper ideas. You can outflank the enemy. And we know through 9/11, we know through the transatlantic collapse who the enemy is. We know through the Greenie policy, which I haven't gone through in much detail, but it's the same idea. Roosevelt gives you an insight into what Lynn is doing 50 years, 60 years later. And at a level of deeper knowledge even of the history, of the scientific crisis and so on that we're in. And so what we've done is we've taken the idea of Glass-Steagall not as simply some reform where people will have their money protected, because it's not a monetary policy. It's a credit policy of a totally different system. And we don't need Wall Street. And let me tell you, I can give you, the Wall Street in London are completely freaked out, to use that word. They thought Glass-Steagall was stopped. It would never even get to the Senate, a bill in the Senate. It would never move. That would never be supported. And they basically just said it won't work, it won't work, it won't work. And they tried to demoralize people. Because of what Lynn did and what we did with him and so forth, and the policy committee, because of that, we not only kept Glass-Steagall alive, we've made it a central debate in the banking world, in the financial world, in Washington, D.C., in the United States. Probably the best example of this, rather than going through a million details, is what happened in Atlanta in the last week. And because what happened there was we had a number of states where resolutions have been, and they're resolutions that basically say to the Congress, support Glass-Steagall. And many, we fight with all these people. You have to understand a credit system. You have to understand the future. But at any rate, about 25 states have these resolutions, including New York, California, some of the bigger states, Illinois, and so on and so forth. Okay? So we went to this week in Atlanta, there was a meeting of the National Conference of State Legislators. I guess, I don't know how many delegates were there. At least 1,000 or 800 or 1,000. I don't know how many state legislators there are in the United States, but probably at least a few thousand. So we had some people who were going to introduce a resolution on Glass-Steagall into the committee and hopefully onto the floor of the conference. What happened was, just as we saw before in Delaware, in California, as soon as we entered a resolution, the office got called by bankers, by the California Banking Association. Don't do it, it won't work, it's not going to get anywhere, and they're wrong, this is a LaRouche operation. And many of these people did not back down. Now, what happened is we had a couple of legislators, including a woman from Delaware, who was going to introduce a resolution to the committee before it even got to the floor on these issues. And the bank lobbyists showed up in force. Wells Fargo, Union Bank of Switzerland, J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, and so on and so forth. And they were basically telling these legislators, if you go with this, we're going to cut you off, we're going to pull our employees out, we're going to do this, that, and the other thing. And they put so much pressure on the woman from, really not on the woman from Delaware. What they did was they put pressure on the Delaware delegation, who went to her and said, you can't do this, you can't do this. It's going to have a bad effect on our state. They're going to hurt us. And so she backed off. And at this point, there was coverage of it, and the bankers thought, we've won. We forced Glass-Steagall back. It's over. Now what happened was very interesting, because 5 state legislators, one from Washington, one lead a woman from Maine, I don't remember every state, Maine, another person from Delaware, they brought, through various maneuvers, they brought Glass-Steagall to the floor in a debate by going around the rules. They basically came up with an amendment. They amended another piece of legislation. The chair tried to rule it out. Our member called for a floor debate on whether or not to rule it out. And that led to a debate on Glass-Steagall and the relevance of Glass-Steagall. So the bankers were completely freaked by this, because they thought they had ended the debate, ended the discussion, and they hadn't. And because we're beginning to find small numbers of political leadership, besides ourselves and a few others, who are being forced to step forward. And so we're in a situation where these fights can be won. And given the way we're fighting with a minority, with a small number of people. You have to have a certain smell of victory, because it's not going to be obvious. The American Revolution was not obvious. This is the point that Laney was making yesterday at MacArthur. In many cases, he had no way to win, but he won. And we're in that situation politically. Victory is available. If we expose 9/11, if we continue the fight around Glass-Steagall, we can win this fight, not just in the United States, because the more activity there is in Europe, anywhere in Europe, Italy, France, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, anywhere, this heightens the battle not only internationally, but in the United States. And if we break through in the United States, which could happen, this will be another shot heard around the world. And that's what we're about. The reason I go through all the background, because you need to know where these things actually are, who the real enemy is. It's not your next door neighbor. It's not somebody else's religion. Okay? I'll end it there.
Yeah. One thing I think that the American Revolution, if you look at it historically, is the most significant loss for or defeat of the oligarchical principle or the oligarchical faction. Look in the total of known history as such.
I think it's certainly, the thing that you have to realize is it's never been a quite completed victory. But it certainly was the most significant confrontation with at least the modern oligarchy, the oligarchy since the Renaissance. Because, this was a principle that still exists. It still exists because we're fighting for it, and it still exists in the history of the United States. That's why I bring up Roosevelt still remains a kind of, even though we're now 2-3 generations from Roosevelt's passing, he still is, because of certain policies like Social Security, and because of the memories of World War II, even though it's often brought up for other reasons by the British, when you bring up World War II, you in effect implicitly bring up what Roosevelt did. So it's a living memory, or vague memory, even to generations that weren't alive at the time. So yeah,
the biggest setback in
yeah.
history or something
Yeah. So yes, the American Revolution is the center of the strategic situation even to this day.
I have just one short, just so that everybody has an idea of what we're going to do. Because our delegation from our office has to leave at 3 o'clock. So my proposal is that we break up now and we eat quickly, and then everybody helps us to get, help us just to some of the logistics, and then we have a concluding discussion from around 1:30, latest 1:30, 2 or 3.
Okay.
So we have you there and Leni and Tom. So if people have questions, just don't forget them, take them up after the, after the thing.